soft cover, the Print's platform for the launch of select non-fiction books. And I have with me today a very interesting book. And why I say interesting is because, of course, I've read on this subject a lot, but this particular book brings out a different aspect, brings out a different perspective on the whole issue. Well, I'm talking about the 1971 war, but no, this is not a regular 1971 war book. This actually comes with a different perspective altogether. And the book that I'm talking about is, of course, the book that I'm talking about is, of course, is titled "The True Story of History's Deadliest Storm and the Liberation of Bangladesh, the Vortex." And it's been written by Scott Carney and Jason Miklian. And for viewers, who these both are, actually, Scott is an investigative journalist. So he's somebody from my brotherhood. He's an investigative journalist and anthropologist, as well as the author of New York Times bestseller, What Doesn't Kill Us. He spent 6 years living in South Asia, reporting on South Asia. And Jason, on the other hand, is a PhD and is a senior researcher at the Center for Development and Environment, University of Oslo. And he's published over 60 academic and policy works on the issues of conflict and crisis based on extensive fieldwork in Bangladesh, Colombia, India, and Congo. So before we go ahead, I'm sure you viewers would like to see this book. I have this wrapped here. So I'll just go ahead and unwrap it. Well, there you go. This is the book, The True Story of History's Deadliest Storm, Liberation of Bangladesh, the Vortex, published by, of course, HarperCollins.
Yeah. Thank you so much. We haven't even seen the cover yet. We don't even have that edition yet. You have the first printing of that book, and we are just overjoyed that we are able to publish this in India and South Asia in general. We both have spent incredible amount of time in India. I was there for 6 years. Jason has been there for nearly as long. And it's important that South Asian readers, Indian readers, understand the magnitude of this war and how close, the events which started with a cyclone, how close that spiraled out of control almost to nuclear Armageddon. And I think a lot of Indians, of course, there's a lot of animosity between India and Pakistan that goes back all the way back to partition, basically. And I think that it's very easy to think of this as a regional conflict, right? To think of Pakistan and India's fight as just sort of remaining in South Asia. But what we really brought out in the Vortex is through intensive investigative research, transcripts from Yahya Khan, who was the president of Pakistan at the time, and Indira Gandhi, and also the leadership in Bangladesh and people on the ground, was that this had enormous global ramifications, and it really changed the course of not just South Asian history, but world history.
Yeah, true, absolutely. And I can say that this book has gone through a lot of research, and it says also this book is the product of more than 200 interviews over 4 years. Multiple trips to Bangladesh and correspondence with the sources in Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, the United States, UK, South Africa, and elsewhere. So my first question is, how did you think about this book? There's a lot been written about the 71 war. It's all done from a historical military point of view. But how did you come out with this book? What really made you write this?
You're absolutely right. And we did see so many of these books that are, some really exceptional books, a lot of memoirs, a lot of firsthand stories, both from Bangladeshis and also, importantly, from Pakistanis who saw what was happening and felt like they couldn't stop the genocide. But what we didn't see really as much is a couple of things. First is the relationship between the Great Bola Cyclone, which is what many people say history's worst ever natural disaster, and then the election and conflict that followed. So one of the things we really thought would be important to bring out is to do quite a bit of research and to understand understand really how the storm precipitated and triggered the conflict that followed, because that was something that we didn't see in many of the very, very good books that are already out there on the 71 war. And the second thing also is we wanted to bring, as outsiders, we wanted to bring this outsider, more bigger picture perspective, like Scott was talking about, to bring in this relationship between Yahya Khan and Richard Nixon, who were, by all accounts, best friends at the time for two leaders that didn't have a lot of friends in the world. So that personal relationship really altered the arc of policy in this war. And then the third thing really is to just really bring out, especially for an American audience that has long since forgotten the importance of this, what a military and, more importantly, moral triumph this was for India. So when the genocide occurred, India stepped up to help first the refugees, but then also train and fight to help fight the war itself. And this clear moral victory, moral foreign policy action by India going up against the United States and having a resolution that results in liberation and victory is something that it's so inspiring and is worth not only the American audience remembering, but also the South Asia audience re-remembering the role that India played in this great, this horrible event, but ultimately great victory for the people of Bangladesh.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, our villains
waiting to have his run. Tell me, Scott.
Oh, I mean, yeah, it's as two American writers, it's interesting to write a book where the villains are the American president and the Pakistani president, and India really does come off as the heroes because they were the heroes in this, with the Mukti Bahini, who were the freedom fighters on the ground, who were essential as well. Nixon gets a bad rap, gets a well-deserved bad rap in America, as does Kissinger. I mean, these people are, they've committed multiple genocides in the course of their terms. And it's no shock at all that two, genociders of a feather flock together. I mean, Yahya Khan was a terrible human as well, who basically stole his ideology, at least his military tactics, from the Holocaust. And, he fought in World War II, spent time in a Nazi prison camp, and basically just took that as his rule book to massacre up to 3 million people in what is now Bangladesh, what was then East Pakistan. It's crazy to think of the scale of that. I mean, right now we are in this terrible war in Ukraine, right? And hundreds of thousands of people have, maybe 100,000 people have died so far. And we're about a third of a year in when we're recording this. The slaughter that was happening in East Pakistan at that time was roughly 10 times as bad as it is in Ukraine right now. And it is something that we were talking about then, and we should continue to talk about because, history will repeat itself. And, as India has built a wall all around Bangladesh. And this is how we discovered that we wanted to write about this book. There's this is basically a fence with armed guards, BSF, border guards every kilometer or so. And when we wrote an article about this, for Foreign Policy about 10 years ago, I believe, we wanted to know why India had built this wall. And when we started talking to leaders on the Indian side, they said, we're worried about climate refugees. And I was like, climate refugees? What do you mean? I had never heard of the Bola cyclone, which killed 500,000 people in the course of a few hours, and then really was this catalyst for what was going for everything that happened all the way leading up to this nuclear exchange we were minutes from launching nukes. And what's interesting for us is that as we head into a world where climate change is going to be the big story, which is going to be the thing that affects world events, if you can see how one storm almost triggers a genocide, a revolution, and a nuclear war exchange, then in a new country, then we will see that climate will affect many things in the future, and that these will be drivers that don't just happen where you lose some farmland on the coast or your beachfront property. You're actually, every storm is this roll of a dice where you could end up in human catastrophe, because storms don't just land on coastlines, they land on political systems.
Absolutely. And for readers, one of the other things that this book brings out is also for the fact that some documents like Yahya Khan's service record are presented here publicly for the first time. So this book is a very interesting book. I've gone through it. Amazing book. It starts off with individual stories and all, and the second chapter is actually based on Aga Muhammad Yahya Khan, and it is 18 months before landfall. So landfall is when the cyclone hit. So 18 months before landfall. So what was happening in Pakistan and between Pakistan and the US 18 months before landfall? What changed?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it of course the foundational element of this is the 1965 war that sent the sanctions upon both Pakistan and India. So Yahya Khan,
the American sanctions on Pakistan and India.
That's right. Yeah, yeah, and what happened is Yahya Khan didn't have the weapons, the resources he needed in order to keep control of his country. But one thing that he did have was a friendship with Mao in China, which is something that very, very few leaders around the world at the time had. Now, Nixon himself was an old friend of Pakistan. He went there in the 1950s. He had this relationship with Pakistan that he never had with India. He considered the Pakistanis friends and of upright moral standing, but he said of the Indians, many derogatory things over the course of his presidency, and especially after all of this came out in the Nixon tapes and Gary Bass's great book called The Blood Telegram. People really saw the depths of his racism against the Indians. So that was another thing that drew Yahya and Nixon together. They hated the Indians. They both really wanted to work with China, and they each had something the other one needed. Yahya desperately needed Nixon's weapons, and Nixon desperately wanted a way to talk to Mao. So that's really how their friendship first started. Like you say, about 18 months before the Bola cyclone, Nixon comes to Pakistan. Yahya gives him this wonderful welcome. They bond as friends, and then they come to this deal that they're going to make, which is the weapons, American weapons for Chinese, for a diplomatic opening with China.
Well, that's true, and for viewers, this is very important. Remember that it is not now that China and Pakistan have developed relationship. China and Pakistan have developed, had a relationship going long time back, right to Nixon Kissinger days. It was Pakistan who actually tried to mediate the friendship between the US and China at that time. You earlier, Scott, you mentioned about Yahya, being great friends with Nixon, and this book mentions also, the historian Gary Bass, who said that Yahya might have been Nixon's only real friend in the world. Is that so?
That's what we have come up with in our reporting. I mean, we obviously Nixon's dead now. We and so is Yahya, so we couldn't ask them. But yeah, they really had a similar take on the world. If you look at in America right now, Donald Trump loved all of the dictators in the world. Like if you were a dictator, Donald Trump was your best friend. And I think Nixon had an element of that as well, where he saw in Yahya a man who would get things done by any means necessary. And he really respected that because he didn't care that it would cost millions of lives, as long as you could, realpolitik, as long as you could get your objectives complete. Nixon was in favor, and they were also raging alcoholics and womanizers, so they also had that to bond on as well.
Yeah, and I would also add to that too, it wasn't just the archival materials, but we actually talked with the Nixon Library. They sent us so many different pictures and audio tapes of the period. And we also managed to get into the Associated Press archives to where we could actually see video of some of these events with Nixon and Yahya interacting with each other. And it's so clear when you watch these that these are two friends. This isn't this stuffy state dinner where everyone's polite to each other. I mean, these guys are having a blast. They really were friends, and it showed in a way that, you look at some of Nixon's other state events, and he is very much that off-putting, awkward guy. But with Yahya, it was like a lost brother.
Yeah, we had these great transcripts. There's one where Nixon and Yahya are basically just like toasting to each other after they've made a big deal. And Yahya's just slurring all of his words and be like, we are the greatest of friends. And it was interesting to try to alliterate that into the book. But yeah, I mean, these people would pal around till like 4 a.m. drinking Black Dog whiskey and doing arms deals that would essentially, what Yahya wanted was to beat India in the next war. And he really believed that the American weapons would let them do that. It turns out they didn't help them beat India.
That's true. And, this book, there's one thing, there are many things from this book that I didn't know that I've learned for the first time. But there's an interesting, for example, when Yahya and Nixon met for the first time, Nixon gave him a gift. And the gift was actually 2 packs of astronaut ice cream. It was a top secret NASA project for the Apollo mission and wouldn't be available commercially for another 6 years. So Nixon gave him those hydrated ice cream, which Yahya, of course, passed it over to his son.
That's right. And yeah, this was, I think one of our advantages from this outsider perspective is that we were also able to talk with, we could talk with Indian sources, Bangladeshi sources, but we also reached out to quite a few Pakistani sources. And these are people who, were friends of Yahya Khan at the time, not just his subordinates or employees, but people who also maintained relationships with him and his family after everything fell apart. So we were able to get some bits of information like this that really showed the complexity of Yahya's character. Because, one of the things that is often written about him is that he was just effectively an idiot, a simpleton. And that's not entirely true. Like he had a very simple life philosophy, but he was a complex individual who was thrust into a situation where he did the only thing that he had experience with. So it's, and he was also surrounded by people who, tried to take advantage of that for their own aims. So it's not at all, I don't think that the book at all paints a flattering picture of Yahya. He was just a more complex individual who had his own personal issues that spilled over into what became genocidal policies.
Absolutely. One thing that I'm surprised is the fact that Pakistan and US had become friends. Both the presidents were great friends, sharing ice cream, NASA ice cream. But how is that the US never really, at that time, back then in the 60s, the US government was, the Department of Defense and Navy had launched this Project Storm Fury, the government's first significant attempt to control the climate with technology. And they had set up these special programs for the Department of Defense, which are supposed to look at various kind of storms. So how is that the US never really informed Pakistan about this upcoming storm, or was Pakistan informed?
So this is an interesting, still a matter of debate when you look at it. America had just, the National Oceanic and Aeronautic Association, NOAA, had launched a satellite which would give real-time television data to anyone who was watching of the Northern Hemisphere, including what was going on in the Bay of Bengal. And the Pakistani Weather Service had access to that feed, and India presumably also had access to that feed, but the warning never made it to the coast of Bangladesh for a number of reasons. I mean, so one thing that happened was that we begin the book with this ship called the Mahajag Mitra, which is the first ship to go out into the cyclone. They didn't know it was there, and their job was basically to relay to other ships, is this a bad storm or is it not? It turned out to be a pretty bad storm because the ship sank, and they relayed this to anyone who could listen to maritime channels. And it is often said that the Indian Navy didn't bother to warn Pakistan because they were like, well, it's their problem. They can deal with this whatever's going to hit their coastline, because they were enemies at that time. But it's also likely that Pakistan was able to pick up this broadcast as well from the Itos-1 satellite, and they did not transmit that information to the coastline, either because of incompetence or maybe a darker purpose, if they just didn't care about Bengalis. It's not entirely clear which one that is. I mean, obviously the records are difficult to go through, but certainly after the fact, we have one general who was meeting with one of our sources from NOAA said to him in the sort of the fact-finding mission, that storm solved 500,000 of our problems, which is to say it killed 500,000 Bengalis. And that was because there was a national election that was going to happen in 2 weeks after the storm hit. That was 500,000 votes that weren't going to go for the Bengali side of politics. So there was this real callousness in the Pakistani infrastructure, who basically treated East Pakistan as a colonial fiefdom. And they certainly were not upset that so many Bengalis died. And you can see that in their aid response, which was disastrous. Afterwards, there was cholera epidemics, starvation, just so much damage in that coast. And the army basically withheld aid from the affected peoples, which, in their minds, killed more people, fewer votes. On the other hand, it also galvanized the Bengalis to be like, this Pakistani government hates us. And eventually, when the election happened, which was again 2 weeks later, what they thought was going to be a divided contest with all of those small regional parties voting against each other's interests, they thought that the Islamabad would retain power. And it turned out that basically every Bengali citizen in Pakistan voted for the Awami League. And it was such an electoral sweep that they had enough votes just in East Pakistan to take over the entire Pakistani government, and which is what set the stage for the genocide.
That's great. You mentioned that, this storm, the cyclone, the Great Bola cyclone killed 500,000 people. 500,000 people, as the viewers would know, is 5 lakhs as far as Indian way of counting is concerned. And imagine what was Pakistan's reaction. It's complete destruction. 500,000 people have died, 5 lakh people have died, their own citizens, their own fellow brothers, sisters, women, children. And this chapter 14, talks about Yahya Khan's visit to East Pakistan. I think he had just come from China. And his first reaction was, it doesn't look so bad. And then I'm reading out from the book, gripping an ice cold beer, Yahya directed his casual assessment both to the pilot and to himself. As they, in a propeller plane, they took an aerial view of it. I read it and I felt really sad, felt really upset. But why was it? Was Yahya Khan, as you said, it was 500,000 less number of votes. Was that something that was on his mind, or was it the fact that he didn't really want to get bothered with it because he wanted to go back home and call up Nixon?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and this is something when we found that information too, along with not only Yahya's affidavit, but the interviews that pilot had actually done. I think that I agree with you. This was one of the saddest and most infuriating comments, because it just really showed that Yahya did not care at all. You can make all the excuses you want about him coming from the military and being used to seeing scenes of death and destruction. But anyone with any shred of personal humanity or empathy for the Bengali people would have seen an entire region of flooded islands and understood what that meant. So, for him to say that and think that, and then just go right back off to West Pakistan, I think that scene shows so vividly how little he cared, even at the same time that he was legitimately trying to build a free and fair election. It was just something that he had no idea and no inkling that they would ever actually lose power because of that election. So he takes that flight, he goes back home, and he really doesn't think too much about it until the weeks of international pressure, as information's coming out from East Pakistan, force him to go back.
Absolutely. And, on the day that he actually boarded his personal plane for Islamabad without leaving the airport or meeting the officials tasked with the Ebola response, he refused to declare East Pakistan a disaster area or worthy of a national emergency. Two actions that would have allowed the local government to reallocate their meager resources to relief. This book brings that point out. It's an interesting thing that you mentioned that Yahya Khan actually was trying for a free and fair election. We of course make Yahya Khan the villain. There's no doubt about the fact that he was actually a villain. But would you agree with the assessment? And this is something that the book also brings out. Do you agree with the assessment that yes, while Yahya Khan was villain, the real villain of the entire, the genocide that followed, the rigging and the genocide that followed, and eventually the war, was actually Bhutto himself, not necessarily Yahya Khan?
Oh, they're both terrible people. I mean, give them both credit for the genocide. No, Yahya was instrumental in carrying it out. Bhutto was like this snake whispering in his ear the whole time, manipulating him for his own, political advantage, because obviously Bhutto eventually rises to power and takes over Yahya's job. But no, they were in it together, and without both of them, the genocide wouldn't maybe not even have happened, right? And because Bhutto was not a military genius, right? And Bhutto was just a snake, whereas Yahya sort of had the gumption and the managerial skills that it took to pull it off. So no, they were in cahoots entirely. And one thing that I'm very happy that we are able to do in this book is show just how terrible and scheming Bhutto really was the entire time. And it's fascinating to me that in present day Pakistan, Yahya Khan is considered horrible. Like everyone looks at Yahya Khan and be like, you lost half our country. You're a terrible drunk. You're a sex addict. You're a horrible person. But Bhutto has a little bit of a softer image in Pakistan at the moment, right? He's obviously he was eventually hung for treason, but there are elements of his reign. Yes, and I think that one thing that we were really happy to bring out is show the honest Bhutto at that time, which is an honest depiction of Bhutto, not the honest Bhutto, to show that he was a genocide heir. Like he schemed, he imprisoned people, he helped murder people, and he was instrumental in all of that. And I don't think that he deserves at all the reputation that he has, even if it's conflicted in Pakistan. He doesn't even deserve the conflicted reputation. He was a horrible human.
And I just add to that too, it's so easy for all of us to see, from the events of 1971, how they reverberate today. And the fear that Pakistani leaders especially have in doing this sort of free and fair election, because it's something that could spiral out of their control. So I think that this is something that politicians have really internalized. And as Scott said, yes, Yahya is the man who broke Pakistan, but Bhutto has this different reputation. One of the other things when we started going into the details of the archives that it really surprised me is that, of course, Yahya, Bhutto, Tika Khan, Niazi, all of the people who were instrumental in the genocide wrote memoirs and affidavits after the fact. And one of the most disturbing things is that they were all quite willing to admit their role in the genocide. But what they were all trying to do is blame the other one for the fall of Pakistan itself. So I think that those were some very telling documents that showed the mentality of these leaders at the time. They were much more concerned about their own personal image than trying to hide the fact that they had done these deeply despicable things.
Well, no doubt about it. I completely agree with you. Then the elections happened. Then the genocide happened. Tika Khan, the great butcher, who went in and killed lakhs of people, raped his forces raped women. They were actually going in for a cultural genocide. They were trying to wipe out the Bengali race. The US, didn't get directly into the war per se, but the US played its side too. And you mentioned that, it was close to setting off a nuclear war. Why was it? Who was going to launch the nuclear weapon? Why was it so close to a nuclear war?
Yeah, as we get, after, India invades, right? So what happens is Yahya Khan launches the most pathetic series of airstrikes on Indian territory ever imagined in military ideas. Like he sent like a dozen planes across the border and put some potholes in the airport in Jaipur. And he thought that this was going to wipe out the Indian Air Force. Didn't work. And Indira Gandhi was, she knew there was going to be a war. And she was, her first reaction was like, thank you. Like, thank God he started it, because now we have the absolute right to go defend ourselves. And then India launched over the border with a vastly superior force. And while the Pakistanis were just murdering people, it's easy to murder unarmed civilians, but it's a lot harder to, murder the people with the tanks and the aircraft who are going to kill them. And it was clear that East Pakistan was going to fall very quickly. But Yahya Khan was great buddies with Nixon and Mao, and he sent out these urgent drunken telegrams to them saying, "Hey, we need your boots on the ground. We need your American boots on the ground. We need another front in the north from China. Help us." And Nixon, we had all these forces over in Vietnam, right? America was fighting a war in Vietnam. We had all of these aircraft carriers and whatnot over there, and we sent the USS Enterprise, which was our premier aircraft carrier. It had all of the armaments it would need to destroy entire countries, and they had explicit permission to destroy the Indian Air Force, which they probably could have done. And they steamed into the Bay of Bengal. India sent out some BBC reporters on an airplane to actually get visual contact with the Enterprise, and all hell breaks loose. But meanwhile, India was an ally with the Soviet Union. Yeah. And the Soviets sent in a submarine attack fleet and missile cruiser fleet from Vladivostok, and they actually cut off the Americans in the Bay of Bengal. And the orders got a little confusing, but essentially the Russians were told to draw this red line in the sea, where there was just if the Americans passed this, they could destroy the USS Enterprise. Meanwhile, the Enterprise had permission to go destroy the Indian Air Force, and both strike groups were carrying just a bazillion nukes, like Hunt for Red October, dangerous stuff. And Kissinger tells Nixon, maybe we should just start lobbing nukes. Like, maybe this is the time that we need to actually end everything. And then the Soviets do this crazy thing. Right? The Soviets do not want a nuclear war, but they also can't let the Americans pass this unknown line in the sea. So they line up 3 nuclear submarines and actually surface them right in front of the carrier within strike range, which is not something you want to do if you're a submarine captain. Like you want to remain hidden, but they actually create that line, and both the submarine fleet and the Enterprise are basically like gunslingers, not knowing what to do. And the only reason that and they both have orders to shoot. The only reason this doesn't happen is because the Indians' army, with the Mukti Bahini, who are the freedom fighters, make it to Dhaka and depose Niazi, who was the general over there. And that's the only reason that we didn't nuke the planet. That's the only reason. Let me put this in another way. This is the only reason you are alive right now, is that India's army took Dhaka, and there was no reason for the war anymore. And then both the Soviets and the Americans sort of floated away on the ocean. And it's crazy how little we think about this right now. This is as bad as the Cuban Missile Crisis. And we came within minutes of me not being born. I don't know how old you are, but maybe you were alive, maybe you weren't.
Well, that's a national state secret, the age. Well, thank you to both of you for writing this book. enjoyed reading this book. Brings out great nuggets. So viewers, I usually don't ask you to go ahead and buy a particular book that we've releasing, but do go ahead and grab your copy of The Vortex, the true story of history's deadliest storm and the liberation of Bangladesh, published, of course, by HarperCollins. Thank you so much for being on the show, and thank you so much for writing this book. Thank you.
Yeah, really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you very, very much.